So what is the alternative to capitalocentric prioritizations of capitalist economies? In their work in the early 2000s, Gibson-Graham come up with the notion of diverse economies to describe what they are after. One of the most helpful visualizations of this argument makes use of an iceberg metaphor, or, if you prefer, a floating coconut metaphor. So here we have two pictures. There's the iceberg and a coconut. Both are floating on water, and you see just a small part of the iceberg or the coconut above the waterline. In this part that is visible, you have practices like wage labor, commodity markets, capitalist enterprise, and the kind of general formal economic activities of our lives, jobs, and loans and that kind of things. Above the waterline, that's the part that is visible, and beneath the waterline, the part there's a bigger part that is not visible. You have all kinds of economic practices, from informal loans to theft, from barter to non-monetary service production in households. You have elder care to housework, gleaning, oral traditions. You have parenting, scavenging, open source resources, hunting, all kinds of practices which we usually do not think about when we think about the economy. This is an iceberg/coconut that denotes capitalocentrism and all that is missing from its regime of prioritization. So the part that is visible above the proverbial waterline is what we usually talk about when we talk about the economy. Nothing new here. But underneath the waterline is an abundance of practices no less crucial for our well-being and survival, and no less widely distributed in space and time. The point of challenging capitalocentrism is to say that this wider, more heterogeneous economy also matters. In fact, it plays a critical role in how economic coexistence takes shape and in influencing the prospects of a livable planetary future. The way that Gibson-Graham proceed to reorganize the coordinates of this already existing economy often makes use of lists and tables that help us visualize and categorize this diversity. Although tables may appear to fix and freeze things at their place, these are tables made for discussing intertwined categories and interdependent shifting practices. So what we see here is a diverse economies table. We have 5 columns. From the left to the right, there's labor, enterprise, transactions, property, and finance. 5 different categories. And in each category, you have the part that we usually talk about when we talk about the economy. So for instance, in labor, you have wage labor. Underneath wage labor, you have alternatively paid labor. So for instance, forms of self-employment or in-kind work or work for welfare programs, and reciprocal labor. And underneath alternative paid category, you have unpaid work. So for instance, housework, volunteering, self-provisioning, and slave labor. The part that is usually very informal and very little talked about when we talk about the economy or labor. So for the enterprise category, you have capitalist enterprise, limited liability corporations and the like. Then underneath you have alternative capitalist and non-capitalist enterprise. So alternative capitalist enterprise can be state-owned enterprises or environmentally responsible enterprise or socially responsible enterprises, non-profits of different kinds. And in non-capitalist enterprise, you have worker cooperatives of democratic organization forms. You have community enterprises, you have feudal enterprises of enforced labor, and so on. In the third column, you have transactions. So transactions, usually we think about market transactions when money and services and products exchange hands. But here we also, with this table, we think about alternative market transactions and non-market transactions. So in these two categories, we have alternative practices such as fair trade or barter or underground markets, invisible markets. and non-market transactions. In this category, we are thinking about household sharing, gift giving, hunting, fishing, gathering, and so on. Also forms of theft, piracy, poaching. In the fourth column, we have property. And usually when we think about property, we think about private property. And this table shows that properties are again different. There are alternative forms of private properties, such as state-managed assets, community lands, community land trusts, and so on. Forms of intellectual property that are alternatively held, and so on. And then you have open access properties such as the atmosphere, you have international waters, you have open source intellectual property, and outer space. And in the fifth category, we're thinking about finance. Usually with finance, we think about mainstream market finance, loans and investments and banks and that kind of usual suspects of the financial world. And with this table, we can also think of alternative finance or alternative market finance and non-market finance. In the alternative market finance category, we're thinking with forms of cooperative banks or credit unions. We're thinking about community-based financial institutions. We're thinking about microfinance. And in the non-market finance category, we're thinking about family lending, sweat equity, donations, or interest-free loans, that kind of practices. With this diverse economies table, for instance, we may begin to map different economic processes here discussed under the themes or practices of labor, enterprise, transactions, property, and finance. For each of these categories, there is a diversity of forms and practices that are in no way reducible to the capitalocentric prioritizations of wage labor, private property, capitalist enterprise, or the like. And we can look more closely into one category, say transactions, in order to flesh out all the ways that products and services exchange hands and the rules that organize how we interact and encounter each other in transacting. In this picture, we see a table for transactions diversity. So on the left column, again, we have different categories for different forms of transactions or exchange. We have non-market transactions such as household flows, gift giving, and theft. We have market exchange such as the so-called free markets. We have differently regulated markets. We have niche markets. And then we have a category for other markets. For instance, the sale of public goods. We have ethical or fair trade markets. We have local trading systems. We have co-op exchange and so on. Barter and so on. And on the right, we're seeing different rules of encounter for each category of transactions. So we're thinking about the rules that set how and whom encounters each other through these forms of transactions. We're starting to think about how these rules are set and who sets them, how they can be negotiated. So for the practice of gift giving, for instance, the rules of encounter are set by cultural norms of reciprocity. So each time we get a gift, there's some kind of reciprocal element associated with that process. For forms of theft, which is also theft is here understood as a form of transactions, the rules of encounter are set by the illegal right to take property or take something from others. For the abstract idea of a free market exchange, the rules of encounter, at least as they usually are thought of, are set by the so-called laws of supply and demand. For differently regulated markets, the rules of encounter can be set by state policies. And for niche markets, the rules of encounter can be set by social agreements of different sorts. And again, in the other markets category, if we think about fair trade markets, the producer-consumer agreements around different licenses set the rules of encounter. And in underground markets, it is trader agreements the agreements specific to each case that set the rules. And in forms of barter, again, trader agreements set face to face are the ones that set the rules of this encounter, of these transactions. Or think of all the different forms of labor that people are engaged with, and different forms of remuneration, and very often its lack for such work. Here we see a detailed table for labor diversity as an example. So we have two columns. On the left, we have different forms of labor, such as housework, unionized labor, temporary labor, self-employed labor, feudal labor, bartered labor, different kinds of labor. On the right, we have different forms of remuneration, so that for housework, we usually get non-monetary or no compensation at all. For volunteering, we don't usually get compensation, or we might get something non-monetary out of it. For unionized labor, we usually get a protected wage plus benefits. For cooperative labor, for instance, we usually get cooperative wage plus a share of the enterprise or the profit. And for reciprocal labor, we get reciprocated labor in return. So for each category of labor, we get different forms of remuneration, which sometimes take the form of money, but very often not. And this is again just a way to think about the diversity of labor that we are already practicing that gives us sustenance. This is not to say that capitalist forms of economy do not exist, but simply to call into question any framework assuming their dominance or their insulation from other economies. This is a method that Gibson-Graham and other scholars of community economies have come to call reading for difference. And the basic idea is that anywhere, and with regards to any category, form, or practice of economy, heterogeneity is worth studying and visualizing. This method, I quote, proliferates difference in the economic landscape and at the same time calls into question the hegemonic capitalocentric dynamics, mechanistic logics of reproduction, growth, accumulation, commodification, concentration, and centralization, on which capitalism's naturalness or naturalized dominance are grounded. End of quote. What happens is a multiplication of open questions for empirical and theoretical study, as well as political and ethical negotiation. Instead of assuming the proverbial tip of the iceberg / coconut to yield all or most economic power, we see power as dispersed and differentiated across the landscape. But also, we begin to see diversity within the capitalist categories formerly understood as unified. So, for example, a capitalist enterprise comes to be seen not only as part of a wider diverse economy, but also as consisting of differential processes, practices, negotiations, and struggles within. Diversity in this view is found within each economic category, just as it also is their context. For any political economic topic, reading for difference is an exercise worth experimenting with, if only to open new questions about the subject matter. Crucially, this also means rehearsing our concepts of power, exploitation, domination, and struggle in terms of heterogeneity. We are differently positioned in diverse economies, living and acting against and with intersecting forms of power, dominance, and violence. Thus, it's worth underlining that diverse economies are not only about the good stuff, however defined. Think of the household, for instance. Households are absolutely fundamental for our survival and flourishing, and they also can be horrible places. Gibson-Graham, along with other feminist thinkers and movements, have shown how households are sites where some of the most oppressive, gendered and racialized power relations take place. They are places where feudal relations of enforced labor and outright slave work often reign and need to be contested. When a household is seen from a capital-centric perspective, it is often understood as a reproductive site as opposed to the productive economy outside of it. It is often idealized as a site of peace and unity, while struggles are only seen to take place at the workplace, the marketplace, or in political scenes located elsewhere. In reading for difference, we start to see that the household is a place of productive work, of original forms of organization, of demanding processes of management. They are sites where local, regional, and global economies intersect and are related to. It is also a site often of drastic power differences, of different positions and agencies, and of negotiations and struggles. In this way, a reading for difference may be an entry point for discussing and making more desirable economies wherever we are, in circumstances that are often, or always, far from ideal. In fact, an argument could be made that what Gibson-Graham proposed to us is a more violent and more exploitative view of economy compared to capitalocentric accounts, just as it also offers a more promissory or hopeful vista. Through reading for difference, we get more detail. What we do with this newly found knowledge of realities that already existed is the question.